Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are diving into a topic that really hits home for a lot of parents and caregivers out there.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at the potential long-term neurological impacts of head injuries
Okay.
in very young children, like babies and
Ugh.
toddlers,
Yeah.
really those first few years of life. And we're going to be unpacking a fascinating and massive study that looked at the connection
Yeah.
between traumatic brain injuries before the age of 3 and the later development of some conditions that a lot of us are familiar with: ADHD,
Hmm.
autism spectrum disorder, and developmental delay.
These are big ones.
Yeah, absolutely huge. And I think that's why this study is so important.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're drawing on a nationwide longitudinal study that was conducted in Taiwan.
Right.
And what makes this study so powerful for you, for our listeners, is the sheer scale of it.
It's a big one.
It is. It draws on data from their National Health Insurance Research Database, which covers over 99% of the population of Taiwan. That's almost everybody.
Yeah, it's incredible. When you have access to that kind of data, you can really start to see those larger patterns.
Exactly. And it gives us such a comprehensive overview of this potential link between early head injuries and these neurodevelopmental conditions.
Exactly.
So I'm really excited to dig into this data with you. So let's start by setting the stage. We've got this massive data set. How did the researchers actually go about investigating this question?
Well, first they had to identify those kids who had experienced TBIs.
Traumatic brain injury, yeah.
Right, TBIs, before the age of 3.
Okay.
So they identified 7,801 children who fit that criteria.
Wow.
And then they compared them to a control group,
Mm-hmm.
a control group of kids who didn't have TBIs.
All right.
And that was a much larger group.
Yeah.
31,204 children.
Got it. So a significantly larger control group
Right.
to compare them to.
And then they followed these kids over time, tracked them from the time they were enrolled.
Right.
And that was between 1998 and 2008. So we're talking about a significant period.
That is a big chunk of time, yeah.
It is. They were looking to see, did these kids later get diagnosed with, ADHD, ASD, developmental delay?
And those diagnoses, those were based on like a standardized set of criteria, right?
Exactly. They used the ICD-9, the International Classification of Diseases,
Okay.
9th revision. That's a mouthful. It's basically a standard that a lot of researchers use.
And make sure everybody's on the same page.
Exactly. Apples to apples, So they were really rigorous
I see.
in making sure these diagnoses were consistent and reliable.
That's so important when you're working with such a large study like this.
It really is.
You have to make sure everything's really carefully defined. So, after all of this, after tracking these kids for years, what did the researchers actually find? What were the main takeaways for you?
Okay, so here's the core finding that I think it's really quite significant. The children who had TBIs, that group, they showed a significantly higher rate of all 3 conditions:
Okay.
ADHD, ASD, and developmental delay.
Compared to the control group.
Exactly,
Right.
much higher. And when we say significant, we're not just talking like a little bit of a difference.
Right.
It's statistically significant,
Okay.
meaning it's unlikely this just happened by chance. It's a strong link.
I see.
Like the chances of this happening by chance it's less than 1 in 1,000
Wow.
across the board.
Right.
For all 3 conditions, we write that as P is less than 0.001. That's a very strong correlation.
That's really powerful evidence. I mean, it suggests that there's something really going on there. It's a really compelling finding.
Yeah, it really is. But we got to be careful. We've got to be careful not to jump to conclusions.
Right.
We can't say definitively that TBI causes these conditions.
Right. Correlation isn't causation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There could be other factors involved.
Of course.
But this study, it definitely points to a really strong connection.
It really does. It gives us a lot to think about. And one of the things I found really interesting is that the study also looked at when these diagnoses were made.
Oh, yeah?
Like at what age the kids in each group were diagnosed. What did they discover about that?
Yeah, so this is another really key finding, I think, for our listeners.
Okay.
So the children with TBIs, they tended to be diagnosed with these conditions.
ADHD, ASD, and developmental delay.
Right, all of those at a younger age compared to the control group.
Interesting. So it's not just that they were more likely to be diagnosed,
Right.
but they were diagnosed earlier on average.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that suggests that maybe the early brain injury isn't just increasing the risk of these conditions,
Okay.
but it could actually be causing them to show up sooner,
I see.
which kind of makes you think about that normal developmental trajectory.
Right.
Like there's a timeline that we expect to see these things happen.
Right.
And maybe Maybe an early TBI is disrupting that
Yeah.
somehow.
That's fascinating. So we're seeing this pattern of earlier diagnoses for you, for our listeners.
Mhm.
Now, I know that the study also looked at some specific factors within the TBI group that might increase the risk even further.
Oh, yeah. They wanted to really drill down and see, okay, are there certain types of TBIs or
Yeah.
certain circumstances
Oh.
that might make these conditions more likely to develop later on?
Right, right. Like, is it all TBIs or are there some that are riskier than others?
Exactly. So they looked at a few things, like how many times a child had a TBI,
Okay. Multiple injuries.
and how severe the injury was, and how old the child was when they had the TBI.
Oh, interesting.
So one of the most important things they found was the impact of having more than one TBI.
Multiple hits.
Yeah, repeated injuries. Right. They found the highest hazard ratios
Yeah.
for ADHD and developmental delay in kids who had multiple TBIs.
So for you, for our listeners, hazard ratio basically means,
It's a way to measure risk, basically.
yeah.
It tells you how much more likely someone is to develop a condition if they've been exposed to a certain risk factor.
Hmm.
So in this case, having multiple TBIs.
Compared to someone who hasn't had that exposure.
Exactly. So it's like saying, okay, this group of kids with multiple TBIs, they're this much more likely to develop ADHD
Okay.
than kids who didn't have any TBIs. It's a way to compare the risk between groups.
That makes sense. So multiple injuries.
Yeah, those really stood out as a big risk factor, particularly for ADHD and developmental delay.
What about ASD? Did they see the same kind of link with multiple TBIs?
They did see an increased risk for ASD with multiple TBIs, but it wasn't as strong, statistically speaking.
Okay.
It was still there, but it wasn't as clear-cut. So for that finding, the p-value was 0.335, which is above that 0.001 threshold we were talking about before.
So it suggests there might be a connection,
Yeah,
but maybe not as strong of a connection, or they need more data.
exactly. Yeah. More research is needed to say for sure.
Okay, that makes sense. So multiple injuries were a big one, especially for ADHD and developmental delay. What about the severity of the injury? Did that matter?
Yeah, absolutely. They found that the more severe the TBI was, the higher the chances of developing these conditions later on.
That seems intuitive, right?
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, right? Like a bigger injury is going to have a bigger impact.
Right, right. Especially when you're talking about the developing brain.
Exactly. It's so delicate at that age.
Yeah.
So that finding really underscores the need to protect little ones
What are those serious injuries? Yeah.
as much as we can.
Yeah.
But, accidents do happen.
Of course.
But the good news is that most TBIs in young kids are mild.
Yeah.
So there's definitely hope.
Yeah. No, I'm also curious about the age at which the injury happens. It seems like an injury in the first few months of life might have a very different effect than one closer to age 3. What did the study find about that for you?
Yeah, you're right to think about it that way. And the study actually confirms that. TBIs that happened before age 1, those were the riskiest.
Okay.
They had the highest hazard ratios for all 3 conditions. So those first 12 months,
Wow.
really, really crucial.
That makes you feel.
Yeah, doesn't it? Those early months are so critical for brain development. Everything's forming, everything's connecting.
Everything is so new.
Exactly.
Mm.
And so an injury during that time can really disrupt those processes. It's kind of like, imagine you're building a house
Okay.
and somebody comes along and shakes the foundation.
While it's still being built.
Right, exactly. That's kind of what we're talking about here. It can have ripple effects.
That's a great analogy. So we're seeing these key factors for you. Repeated injuries, more severe injuries, and injuries in that first year of life. And the study followed these kids for a long time.
Oh, yeah. They followed them for over a decade in a lot of cases.
So they were able to look at the long-term impact of these early TBIs.
Exactly. And they found something really important. They found that the increased risk of developing these conditions, it persisted over time.
Okay.
So it wasn't just a short-term thing. It wasn't like, okay, they had the injury and then a year later they were fine.
Right.
No, the risk continued. So for you, that means that early childhood TBIs can have lasting effects.
They can have long-term consequences for these kids.
And again, the statistical evidence here was very strong.
Yeah.
All of those p-values were less than 0.001.
So we're talking about a very high level of confidence in these findings.
We are. But, as with any research study, there are always things to keep in mind.
Of course, there are always limitations.
Yeah. And the authors of this study, they were very upfront about those limitations.
Okay, so what were some of the things they pointed out for you?
Well, first of all, we've got to remember that this study shows a strong association, but it doesn't definitively prove that TBIs cause these conditions.
Right, right. We talked about that before. Correlation versus causation.
Exactly. And there could be other factors at play that weren't measured in the study.
Okay.
Things that might contribute to both the TBIs and the later diagnoses.
That's a good point.
So more research is definitely needed to tease all of that apart.
I see.
And also, we got to remember that this study was done in Taiwan.
Right.
And well, brains are brains wherever you go.
Huh.
There might be some cultural or healthcare system differences that could influence the findings.
That's a really important point for you, like how these conditions are diagnosed or what kind of support services are available.
Exactly. So we always have to be mindful of the context when we're looking at research like this.
Absolutely. It helps us interpret the findings more accurately. Now, just to clarify one last thing about the study design.
Okay.
They were comparing the TBI group to a control group of kids who didn't have any TBIs, right?
Yes, exactly. So they were specifically looking at the increased risk in kids who had TBIs compared to those who didn't.
Okay, so they weren't comparing different types of TBIs.
No, not in this particular study. It was really about that overall risk associated with having a TBI.
Got it. Thanks for clearing that up. So to wrap things up for you, for everyone listening, we've learned that this large-scale study from Taiwan found a pretty significant link between traumatic brain injuries in young children under 3 years old
Right.
and a higher risk of later developing ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, or developmental delay.
That's the big takeaway for
But
sure.
it's not just any TBI, right?
No, the study really highlighted some key factors that seem to amplify that risk.
Like multiple injuries.
Yes, having
Yeah.
more than one TBI. The severity of the injury also mattered. And perhaps most importantly, the timing of the injury. Injuries in that first year of life seem to carry the highest risk.
Yeah. And the fact that they followed these kids for so long, over a decade, it really shows that these early injuries, they can have lasting effects on brain development.
It's definitely something to think about. As parents, as caregivers, as a society, we really need to be doing everything we can to protect those little ones.
I completely agree. And I think this study, it really raises some important questions for you, for all of us. Like, what can we do to prevent these injuries from happening in the first place? And for those kids who do experience a TBI, how can we best support them?
Yeah, yeah.
What kind of early interventions can we put in place to help them thrive?
These are big questions.
Yeah.
And this study, it doesn't give us all the answers.
Of course not.
But it definitely points us in the right direction. It highlights the need for more research in this area, and it underscores the importance of early detection and intervention.
Absolutely. It's a call to action for all of us. So, to everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. The developing brain is incredibly complex and vulnerable.
It is.
And these early experiences, they can have a profound impact on a child's trajectory.
They really can.
So let's all do our part to protect those little ones and give them the best possible start in life.
I agree. It takes a village, right?
It absolutely does. So thank you for joining us for this important conversation, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.